It all began with the death of Tsar Alexander III. He was introduced to his reign after his father died of a cruel assassination. Immediately after he received his title, Alexander executed the organization that rebelled against his father. He once again silenced the Russian people, like many other rulers have, a feeling far too familiar. Not much later in 1894, Alexander died, and his son, Tsar Nicholas, rose to power. When Nicholas took over the throne, he was introduced to a land that stretched all the way from the Baltic to the Pacific, inhabited by nearly 126 million people. There was always a line between the poor and the rich in Russia, and it was continuing to become a bigger problem. However, when he took over the reins of this massive country, the separation between these two groups seemed to get larger and much more dramatic. The Russian Revolution was a time where the unprivileged and poor citizens made up the majority of the 126 million population. They were undervalued and viewed as something similar to a sin of the human race. Many were forced to serve as soldiers without proper food, training, and weapons, while the higher class citizens, like the imperial family, lived with gilded luxury. Tsar Nicholas had a family of 7. A month after he took the throne, he married his wife, Alexandra Fenoria, and had 5 children, Alexei Nikolshevich and his 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and Maria. Olga was born in 1895, Tatiana was born in 1897, Maria was born in 1899, Anastasia was born in 1901, and Alexei, the only male child, was born in 1904. As they gave birth to their only male child for the next Tsar, their parents' dreams turned into concern as Alexei was diagnosed with the rare disease known as hemophilia.
Nicholas was desperate to help his son, so he brought a monk from Siberia who allegedly had healing powers. His name was Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was supposed to bring good fortune and as a spiritual advisor, but instead just made everything worse.
In 1905, a revolution broke out when unarmed demonstrators marched towards the Winter Palace to present a petition. They were arguing for the sake of workers' requests. Their massive groups of people were relentless with their peaceful revolts, but shouted with great heart and hate. Soon, the government grew impatient with the crowd and ordered a few soldiers to shoot among the crowd. This later became known as the infamous Bloody Sunday, and this was the first major protest of the many to come. This violent event scared the Russian people back to where they started, as voiceless people with no role in society. They would stay with this mindset for almost another decade until the pot boiled over with hatred for the government, nationalism for the soldiers, and a hope for a new country.
On August 1st, 1914, the country was put into great turmoil. World War I begins and sends tears through Russia's weak and inexperienced army.
Consisting of mostly peasants and the working class, since most of Russia's population was made up of these people. There were devastating defeats and debts while the rest of the country was going through a great food shortage. They were not equipped with any useful weapons to do much damage. Russia had a terrible army compared to Germany and other powerful nations.
In 1917, millions of Russia's army was now killed or wounded. The majority of the army is now gone. At this point, there is not much hope left.
The February Revolution, which was for the most part peaceful, sparked a feeling of pride among Russian peasants and working-class citizens, which later encouraged them to join the fight for a better life. At first, it started with a few protesters in St. Petrograd, arguing for the lack against food being provided for their families, government corruption, the crumbled economy, and their involvement in World War I. They were barely surviving with their rations due to the war, and at times they would have to go to 2 days without eating food. Then, on Women's Day, thousands of women gathered together in the center of the town, joining the earlier protesters, and joined the chants for more food. The next day, even students and workers went on strike, and even more peasants joined the riot. On the first day, there were merely 20 protesters, but only 3 days later, thousands of Russian people were gathered in the center of Petrograd, fighting for their rights. The Russian people were angry at Tsar Nicholas for deciding to maintain their involvement in the war, taking personal command of the Russian army, the ill-equipped status and lack of supplies and weapons, and Rasputin's power over the royal family, including massive food shortages causing starvation and deprivation and political opposition. Everyone refused to leave the streets. Soon, soldiers were ordered to eliminate the uprisings, and a few regiments opened fire on their own people. However, some refused to fire. Many demonstrators and civilians were killed, but this was the turning point. People started losing their trust in the Tsar, including his own soldiers. The frustrated regiments positioned in Petrograd suddenly turned against the Tsar and joined the mobs of people who refused to give up. The imperial family was forced to resign, and the Tsar finally abdicated the throne, ending almost 4 centuries of Romanov and Tsarist rule. Following the Tsar's abdication, the nation initiated a new government that had 2 parties. The first one was the Petrograd Soviet, which brought attention for specific classes. The second branch was known as the Provisional Government. It took care of the national requests and duties. This branch included a state Duma, similar to a court, which acted as an assembly for the country. The provisional government quickly started growing unpopular among the Russian people. The provisional government made the decision to stay in the war, which resulted in many more deaths and casualties among the already tattered and bruised Russian army, and it failed to provide land and easily accessible amounts of food to the peasants. This did not appeal to the eyes of the Russian citizens because it did not solve any of their problems, and it only made things worse. As the Russian people continued to protest against the oppressive government, they needed one more push to meet their goals. This came in form of a man named Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, who had been part of many uprisings and awarenesses of social injustice movements, had started popping up at the national level and was receiving large amounts of attention among the impatient and deprived Russian people. Vladimir Lenin had returned from a decade of exile from Siberia for his previous protest, but upon his return, he showed no signs of backing down. Lenin took advantage of the people's views towards the provisional government and transformed it into a chance for him to take over control.
On November 6th and 7th of 1917, or October 24th and 25th on the Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks, under Lenin, launched a coup d'état, or rebellion, on the provisional government.
They stormed into the Winter Palace and arrested all members that had a role in the provisional government, putting themselves in charge of Russia. After the revolution was complete, the Bolsheviks ended World War I with a peace treaty with Germany known as the Brest-Litovsk.
As an attempt to fix Russia, Lenin used a simple but attention-grabbing slogan: Peace, bread, and land. Peace, the end of Russia's involvement in World War I. Bread, a solution to the food shortages and starvation. And land, which would go to the peasants to have a chance to make something out of their lives. After both revolutions were complete, and Lenin's Bolsheviks were in full control of Russia, for the first time in decades, the people were in full peace and appreciation for their country. This event was remarkable, considering that the lowest classes of the nation, who were barely able to survive, were able to conquer and overthrow a Tsarist rule that had been living in Russia for almost 4 centuries. Lenin fixed the country's flaws and helped the people find jobs, homes, and families. He introduced the 8-hour working day to make working conditions better and to reduce workload on certain classes. This also reduced the labor and stress of the working class. The Tsarist class of Russia stood as a wall dividing the Russian people and their rights. For many years, the citizens' hate for the government simmered, and finally, it boiled over, unleashing groups of passionate people ready to fight for the voices that they were absent of. The Russian people took back their country and broke a barrier that for hundreds of years could not be broken.